Historical Materialism, Chapter 4, Part 2, Production and Property. The mode of production is always social, because each individual does not produce the whole of his material needs for himself solely by his own labor, independent of other individuals. The material goods required by the community are produced by the labor of many individuals, who thus carry on a mutual exchange of activities in producing the social product which is distributed among the community. So in considering the mode of production, we must distinguish first all of the social forces which people bring into operation in order to produce the products, the actual material means whereby production is undertaken, and secondly, the mutual relations into which people enter in producing and exchanging the products. We must distinguish 1. The forces of production, and 2. The relations of production. These together define the mode of production, and changes in the mode of production are brought about by the changes in the forces of production and changes in the relations of production. 1. What, then, do we mean by the forces of production? In order to produce, instruments of production are necessary, that is, tools, machines, means of transport, and so on. But these do not produce anything by themselves. It is people who make them and use them. Without people with the skill to make and use the instruments of production, no production is possible. The forces of production, therefore, consist of A. the instruments of production, and B. the people, with their production experience and skill who use these instruments. 2. And what do we mean by the relations of production? People do not make and use the instruments of production, or acquire and exercise their production experience and skill, without entering into mutual relations in doing so. In making and using the instruments of production, in acquiring and exercising their production experience and skill, people enter into relations with each other, whereby they are associated and organized in the process of social production. These relations are partly simply and direct relations which people enter into with one another in the actual production process itself. Simple and direct relations between people engaged in a common productive task. But when people carry on production, they must enter into social relationships, not only with one another, but also with the means of production which they are utilizing. By the means of production, we denote something more than the instruments of production. We denote all those means which are necessary to produce the finished product, not including only the instruments, which are part of the forces of production, but also land, raw materials, buildings in which production is undertaken, and so on. In undertaking production, then, it is necessary for people socially to regulate their mutual relationships to the means of production. And this is how property relations arise. In social production, the means of production become the property of various people or groups of people. For in carrying on production and exchange, it is necessary that some arrangement should be made, binding on the members of society, whereby it is known who is entitled to dispose of the various means of production and of the product which is produced from their utilization. This regulation of people's mutual relationships to the means of production, and consequently of their share of the product, is not undertaken as a result of any conscious or deliberate act, of any general decision or social contract. It comes about by an unconscious or spontaneous process. People come to regulate their mutual relationships to the means of production and the disposal of the social product in a way corresponding to the forces of production, since otherwise they cannot carry on production. And entering into these relationships in the process of production, they become conscious of them as property relations. In the very primitive production carried on by a tribe of hunters, the hunters enter into simple, direct relations with one another as fellow huntsmen, and the land they hunt over and the beasts which they hunt are not regarded as the property of any particular individuals or groups. The whole tribe organizes hunting expeditions, and what they bring back from the hunt is common property and is shared out among the tribesmen. But when division of labor arises, and one person specializes in producing this and another in producing that, then the instruments used begin to be regarded as the property of particular persons, and so does the product produced become the property of the producer, to be disposed of by themselves. Similarly, when animals are domesticated and herds are raised, herds become the property of particular families, and of the head of the family. At a later stage, land becomes private property. Thus, as a result of the development of the forces of production, for the development of agriculture, handicrafts, and so on, is precisely a development of the forces of production, and as a result of the division of labor which accompanies this development, there gradually arises ownership of the means of production by individual people or groups of people. In other words, private property arises. Here, it can already be seen that the driving force in social development is the development of the forces of production. Property relations are essentially social relations between people, arising out of production. At first sight, property relations may look simple and direct relations between individual property owners and the property they own. This is not so, however. For example, Robinson Crusoe on his island was not a property owner, but simply a man on an island. Property relations are relations between people in society, complex relations between different people, not simple relations between people and things. In the production which they carry on, people establish social relations, or relations of production, between one another, whereby the means of production which they utilize are the property of this or that group, or of this or that individual. Property relations, therefore, are ways of regulating people's mutual relationships in utilizing the means of production and in disposing of the product. Property relations are simply give conscious legal expression to those mutual relationships, which, by being expressed as property relations, appear as obligatory relationships binding on society. Now, therefore, we can define the relations of production as the mutual relations into which people enter in the process of production and which expresses themselves as property relations. And the relations of production obtaining in society at any particular stage of its development constitute the economic structure of society at that stage.